We are midway through a discussion of Aristotle, and we talked about Aristotle's notion of change, and we tried to tie that back to his idea of causation. So hopefully, dots should connect here as we move through. We're coming now to what is considered by many one of the more complicated aspects of his thought, although I don't think it justifies that bad reputation, but it's his categories. If you are a scientist, then you are involved in the art of putting things in categories or categorizing things. That's what scientists do. They look at objects and they organize what they experience by perception. If we couldn't do that, we couldn't do science. We would just be living in a world of infinite details. But the very fact that I can stand here and say that there are, 17 or 18 human beings in this room helps me. I've put you in a category. I can distinguish between a human being and a book. So I don't feel the need to teach the book directly. I can tell the difference between the student and the book. And that's what really human rationality is. And that's what scientists do. But now sometimes scientists have to do it at a very subtle level, very sophisticated, complicated level, but it's still the same idea. So Aristotle, as the supreme scientist, is concerned about how we do that. And that is, therefore, the basis for his notion that there are these categories. Categories, he says, are predicates that are added to subjects. A category is a predicate. There are a variety of kinds of predicates. The subject might be marker. Okay? Marker. Well, I could say of the subject, marker is red, which it is a little bit there. That's a predicate. Marker is in room. There's another predicate. I've categorized it differently. Marker is small. Different predicate. I know this seems like, wow, I think we could have picked this up in the first grade, actually, Mr. Gore. But work with me here. Just trust me. This does go somewhere. All of these are predicates that are added to the subject, and there are various kinds of predicates, and the variety of predicates all spill out, as it were, in Aristotle's philosophy in terms of 10 categories. All right, so I do want you to know these, matter of fact, in case you're wondering. All right, so I'm going to give you the 10 categories. You are going to learn them and love them. You are required to love them. Mr. Williams, of course, says we should inspire our students to love learning. Now, he has this idea that we should just sort of make learning fun, but I think, no, just tell them to, so just love it. Would you just do it? Then I don't have to, work so hard. So, you're going to love these categories, and actually they are kind of interesting. The first category is what he calls substance. Now, little clue, little point. Substance here is basically the term we've already come across, nothing new. We've already distinguished between substance and what? Spencer?
We distinguish between substance and accident.
We have indeed. So now, please be advised that all the rest of these categories are accidental. There is one that is substantial, 9 that are accidents. So now he's kind of taking accidents and breaking it down. These are the perceivable qualities of things, and that's really all we can work with as scientists. As a scientist, I go out into the woods, and I want to scientifically, analyze a creature, let's say a squirrel. Well, what can I do? I cannot scientifically analyze the essence of squirrel. How do you do that? I'm not going to eat it. How do you get the essence of squirrel? You don't. You do external observations. You notice a bushy tail. You notice kind of funny jerky movements. You notice it buries peanuts. That's kind of thing. In other words, all of those are accidental. Those are all things that I can perceive, and that's about where I'm left in my scientific activity. That makes sense? And so even though we think that's just the periphery, in some ways, as scientists, it's the only thing we have to work with. Now, new material. When he talks about substance, he distinguishes between two kinds of substance. This is quite important, crucially important. He distinguishes between what he calls primary and secondary substance. It seems like this is kind of simple, but every year students get confused by it. So I'm going to labor to make this a seemingly simple point. I want all of you to get it. So if you don't get it after I explain it, then let's make sure we get it. All right. By primary substance, all he means by that is a reference to the individual objects that make up the world in which you live. That's all he means. The individual objects. But the problem with that is that here I have two individual objects. You see. And each of them is a distinct substance. This is a substance, that is a substance. And if we leave it at that, then as a scientist, we're in a very tough spot, because that means we have to go through the whole world and individually identify every object we encounter. Well, there may be a couple of zillion things that look kind of like this. And if all I'm ever dealing with is primary substance, then I have no way of classifying them. So, for Aristotle, secondary substance really refers to the name that I attach to the object. It is not, the object is what it is. But I have this remarkable, really astounding capacity as part of my human intellect to give it a name. So the secondary, the primary substance is just, I'm just going to call it the thing, or the thing in itself, which is a term that actually Kant uses, but don't worry about that right now. The thing in itself, but then I give it a name. I call it by the name marker. And even though we take that for granted, we have just done something of astonishing significance. Where do we find such a thing in the Bible? Where do we find this kind of thing going on in the Bible? Yes, Spencer.
Well, that's what Adam had to do.
Yes, that's right. Were you all thinking that, and only Spencer was brave enough to say it? Well, that's right. You see, just think how profoundly, deeply connected that is to our humanity. That the very first, or at least one of the very first commands that God gives to Adam in the Garden of Eden is to do this thing. To give names to things. To look at things and come up with words by which that thing is going to be referenced. Now, we do it all the time, but I think we don't appreciate what a remarkable capacity that is, to give names to things. Well, Aristotle was smart enough to realize that that is a kind of astonishing power that we have. And that really, for him, is the essence of science. That is the focus, and that is why Aristotle is sometimes called, is a word you want to know, he's called a nominalist. And nominalism is thus distinguished from, anybody know what would be the opposite of nominalism in philosophical jargon? It's a term we've already used. I've already attached it to somebody, and now I'm giving you the other side of the story. So we've studied blankism, and now we're studying the alternative to that, which is nominalism. And the name and the term that I'm after here, Sydney, I see this look of incredible wisdom on your face as you're about to say to me, the opposite, Mr. Gore, of nominalism is, of course...
Empiricism?
Well, that's good. No, actually, nominalism and empiricism tend to go together. The opposite of nominalism would be some form of idealism. And way back when, were you going to say that? No? Were you going to say it?
I wish.
Remember I said with Plato, we talked about Plato, said he's an idealist. We're going to go through this course. We're going to talk about a variety of philosophers who are idealists, and they are going to stand in tension with another class of philosophers that come down through philosophical history who are nominalists. And so now we've seen the great idealist, the first one we've looked at in history, who is Plato. And now we're looking at the first great nominalist, who is Aristotle. What's the genius of nominalism? It is the fact that we in our human intelligence can assign names to things. You see, for Plato, I call this a marker. Why? Why do I call this a marker? Stephen, for Plato, what makes this a marker?
Because it has markerness.
Yes. And what does that mean? You've answered correctly. Plato would be proud. What does that mean to say it participates in markerness?
Because it's like modeled after the ideal marker.
Yes. Does Aristotle believe, Laura, that there is an ideal eternal marker? You are correct. That's the big difference. And that's a huge difference. It's a huge difference. For Plato, there is an ultimate, eternal, ideal, archetypal, essential marker. For Aristotle, marker is just a name. It came out of our human mind. It didn't come out of an ideal world. Grab the difference? Every one of you in this room should be thinking, am I more of an idealist or a nominalist? Because every one of us is more one than the other, if you see through to the real implications of it. Because it has to do with many more things than just markers. Was that you, Jordan?
Yeah, you
Go ahead.
answered my question.
Okay. All right, so Aristotle says the most important human activity that we're engaged in is that activity of moving objects from primary to secondary quality. That is, moving objects from simply being things to being things with a name. That's what it's all about. And we can put things with a name inside of broader things with a name, can't we? So I can look at an object. I will draw brilliantly. I mean, anybody looking at that would immediately, well, I'll help you out here. Is that an ant? What is that? Say it. It's an ant.
It only has 4 legs, Mr. Gore.
Oh, they have 6 legs, that's right.
Where's the abdominal?
All right. Hey, I am not Mr. Dykstra, you know what I'm saying? Now, I have just put an object on the board, and Kay Lee was the first one I heard, who did this incredible Aristotelian thing of taking a thing in itself, a little red mark here, and calling it by a name, ant. All right? That's the first stage of this nominalistic process. But, having put this object into the class of ant, can we put the class of ant into a larger class? And that would be the class of, Sydney? Insects. So we can put classes inside of classes. Can we put the class of insect into a larger class? Answer? No. Sarah says, no, actually, we can't. That's it. That's as far as it goes. We know the difference, don't we? Listen, this is Aristotle's jargon. We know the difference between species and genus. And you can move that little paradigm all the way up. We can put the species of ant, as it were, inside of what genus? What would come after that, Ben? We've put this object into the class of ant. We put ant into the class of insect. We put insect into the class of animal. Sounds good to me. And on it goes, until finally it gets into the largest class of all, which is simply things that are, things that exist. All right, so, Aristotle's thinking about how we do this. All right, he's saying the way that we do this, however, will tend to depend on an evaluation of accidents. So let's look at the accidents here. There's 9 more. I'm just going to give these to you and explain them briefly. The first, the second category, the first of these accidental categories, is what he calls quantity. You'll see a little correlation from what we've already looked at now. It keeps expanding. Quantity is basically concerned with how much or how many. So I can imagine a little ant like this one or a big ant. My wife and I have noticed, by the way, as we sit out on our back deck, which we are doing less than we used to because it's getting cold, and we don't like to bundle up to sit out there and enjoy the weather, But anyway, we've noticed this little string of red ants that are going along the top rail of our deck. And they're big old honking things. I mean, they're big ants, And so I keep squishing them one at a time. Because I'm going to take dominion over this, But I've noticed that popping them off one at a time is not having much of an effect. They keep coming back, And I have this very odd feeling that probably somewhere under my foundation or somewhere like that is this ant hill. But they're big. They're not just your little regular ants, and they're red. And they're actually kind of scary looking. I don't know. I'd like to find the actual source of these critters, but I haven't yet. Anyway, so that would be a distinction as to quantity. How big? They may be tiny, they may be huge, and it also includes within it how many. There may be 1, there may be 1,000. In this case, there's probably a couple of million, I don't know, but I'm concerned about it. So that's the first one, quantity. How much, how many. Second, quality. Quality has to do with some sort of identifying feature. It may be color. That'd be the one that would be most readily, I suppose, illustrative of the point. It may be a state of, for example, when I learned this, my philosopher teacher was using Socrates as his example, and his example here would be the quality of Socrates. Socrates is bald, he said. He didn't mean necessarily the Socrates we all know and love. In fact, I think he may have been referring to himself, but he was nevertheless pointing out that's a quality, baldness. Those kinds of things. That is, descriptive adjectives that have to do with the character in some sense of this object. So that would be quality. Next one, place. Socrates is in jail. There's a predicate describing Socrates. It's different, isn't it, than saying he's bald. I could combine them. There is a bald Socrates in jail. But we understand I'm saying two different things about him. Time. When is this? When is Socrates in jail? Is he in jail on Tuesday or on Friday? You know, it's a time issue. It may vary in time. Yes?
Wouldn't time be in the category of quantity of sorts?
How so? What are you thinking?
Well, it kind of deals with lengths and numbers, and like you could say that he was in jail for 2 days or 2 weeks.
Mhm.
They're the quantities, but they're also times. Or what's the
Are you
difference?
thinking of a quantity of time, like 3 days, 5 days?
Yeah.
Yeah. He means quantity here, simply in terms of how much, not how long. So is it Socrates who is 150 pounds or Socrates who is 250 pounds? You know?
Okay.
I thought what you were going to say is a person's quantity may vary over time. That's true. If I'm fasting, then the quantity of me may diminish as time goes on. You know, if I'm feasting, I may.
Okay, so any description that talks about time, even if this number just falls into that category?
Time really just focuses on when is this. If I say Socrates is in jail, all right, that in itself is a meaningful statement, but it may or may not be true for a given time. Is Socrates in jail today? Or was he in jail in 399 BC? You know, I mean, that makes a difference as to the category of the statement. So I predicate something about Socrates, but in order to know whether it's true or false, I have to put some kind of time frame on my predicate. Does that make sense? That's what he's after here. And so Socrates may weigh 250 pounds. He may be bald when he's in jail in 399, BC. Next one out is action. This is the question, what is Socrates doing? Or what is this thing that we're describing doing, if anything? It may just be being, just existing. Socrates is what? Brushing his teeth. That's an action. Drinking hemlock. It's an action. He's doing something. The next one is passion. We might suspect what Aristotle means is what is Socrates feeling, but that's not what it is. He doesn't mean passion in that sense. But he means passion as the opposite of action. You know, those two words are fundamentally opposites philosophically. Action has to do with active behavior. Passion is passive behavior, and so you put it this way. What is being done to Socrates? Action, what is Socrates doing? Passion, what's happening to Socrates? What is Socrates experiencing? Or what is being done to him? In language, we typically have an active voice and a passive voice, right? You all know that from English grammar, and most languages have something like that. The active voice. Trevor punches Gore in the face. Okay? We're not going to illustrate it. We'll just imagine it. Trevor punches Gore in the face. That's the active voice. Put that in the passive voice, Nicole. Put the same statement in the passive voice.
Mr. Gore has been punched.
Okay, you also put it in the past tense, but the passive voice would simply be, Gore is punched in the face by Trevor, right? That's the difference. That's all there is to it. In the first case, somebody's acting. In the second case, somebody's being acted upon. So we can talk about either one in connection with an object, and in the case of Socrates, we could ask either question. The next one, situation. This is the best English word to convey there's actually a better Greek word for this, but I don't know what word to use in English, so I'm using this one, but let me explain what I mean by it. This is, in some sense, descriptive of an object's particular relationship to itself, or some way of describing its relationship to itself, or some aspect of its relationship to itself. Socrates is headed. What does that mean? He is possessed of a head. Right? You see that? I mean, that's it. It's a little tricky, but he's saying sometimes we describe things in connection with something about itself. Socrates is left-handed. Something like that. Yeah.
How is that different from quality? Because quality's...
Yeah, they do seem to overlap a little bit, and by quality, he means, the distinctive thing about a situation is it has some reference to my relationship to something else about me. I am left-handed. I'm not, but that'd be the idea. And so it's kind of subtle, whereas quality in and of itself is just describing something that's true of this thing, basically in terms of what it is. This marker is red. It's really not talking about anything. If I said this marker is capped, okay, what? There's some connection between the cap and the thing, so it's the relationship it has to itself with respect to being capped. Does that make sense? It's a little bit tricky, but that's the notion. The next one, habit. Mr. Cheeley.
Would it, for situation, would it be like a glass is full? Would that fit under? Or is that, I'm still a little bit...
I don't think it would quite fit because the water is not, strictly speaking, part of the glass. It's got to be, in some sense, a description of how this object is related to itself. And I realize I wish I could come up with some better illustrations of that, but it's you single out some aspect of what you are and think about your relationship to that thing. You are sighted. You are possessed of the power of sight. That would be more the idea. Habit is the kind of the old Latin use. This, of course, Aristotle spoke Greek, but it'd be the idea how you are dressed, or dress, or clothing, or garb is what's going on. The habit. We use the word habit usually to apply to a particular kind of person who wears a particular kind of clothing. What is that? Alicia, do you know what I'm talking about there?
I believe it's a monk or a priest.
Oh, there you go. Or a nun. A nun's habit we'll speak of. It's the old word for how you are dressed. It can be broader than that. Habitus is the word meaning where you live, but it all has to do with kind of the situation of your clothing in some sense or other. And then the final one is relation. Relation would be the relationship of this object to some other object. This gives rise to the use of prepositions. The marker is in the room. Well, in the room may be place, but it also carries with it the notion of a relation. It would include other things like beside, above, beneath, around, in, all of those are relation, in which you're talking about this thing in connection with some kind of environment. Now I realize this, you may think, who really cares? But this is actually pretty important. This has been quite helpful, and we tend to have these things pop back up occasionally. So even though I know this seems a little bit over the top to want you to learn these, I do, because you'll be surprised how often we'll sort of come back and make reference to these Aristotelian categories. It just, for whatever reason, has been an important part of philosophical conversation. It's better to have just gotten it in your heads at some point, and then I don't have to keep reminding you we had this conversation. The next term I want to give you, however, in our little odyssey, is the term induction. Question?
For relation and place,
Yeah.
so something like in the room,
Yeah.
it's still a relationship to the room.
Yeah, it is.
But it's also.
And it's subtle, and it's the difference is, in this sense, relation is focusing not so much on in with respect to a particular place, but in with respect to other things. So it's beneath the ceiling, above the floor, beside the teacher. Those are, you can see that it's a focus a little bit, rather than on place, is kind of on relation to other things. That's the focus. But in some ways there is an overlap there. But the place, properly speaking, would be in the room, in Spokane, Washington, kind of deal. It's the location in a kind of sense of place in the universe, rather than a connection to other things in relationship to them. Does that help? That's the idea. Right. What is induction? Inductio. Matthew? What is induction?
I think that's where you have something else and you can tell from that a different thing.
Broadly, yeah. That's either really good, I was going, well, I won't even say that, but I was going to say it's really good beep, but then I decided, well, I won't even. Or you're right, I'm not sure which, but what is the word, Matthew, that is basically the opposite in the discipline of ways of reasoning between induction? Induction is the opposite of? Deduction is right. Okay. Now, can you distinguish those two? What's the difference between thinking deductively and thinking inductively?
Well, I kind of get confused sometimes.
Aha, well, see, from this point on for the rest of your life, you will have it crystal clear.
Well, I think induction is really like Trevor has an angry look on his face, therefore I can tell he's mad at me.
Yes, that would be inductive reasoning. Yeah, that's right. I could see that going either way. All right, that's a good example, because deductively, can somebody make the statement that Matthew just gave us in a deductive way? Can somebody say what what Matthew said deductively? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Josiah, you want to take a run at this one?
Well, it's kind of a tough one. The only way, deduction is when you take something that's general and
Yeah.
something that's specific.
That's right.
Induction takes something that's specific or a principle and making it broad.
Exactly right. That's right.
Generalization.
Now,
But-
Matthew gave us, Trevor has an angry look on his face, therefore, he's angry at me or something. That's your. Can you state that in a deductive syllogism?
Trevor is mad. Or
remember, deduction usually follows this format. All blank are blank. This is blank, therefore this is blank. Remember, you've all studied that, right? Somewhere back there in logic. So can you put what Matthew just said in a deductive syllogism? Lifeline to Sheila.
So Trevor looks angry. All people that look angry are mad, and say Trevor's mad.
Okay, that would be, you reverse the order slightly, but the syllogism is intact, that's right. You could say, all people who are angry at me have an angry look on their face. Trevor has an angry look on his face, therefore Trevor is angry with me. That's a fallacy, the way I just stated that, you know, because I inverted the middle. But it would nevertheless be the idea. You follow that? I'd have to almost say, to make it stick, I'd almost have to say, all people and only those people who are angry at me have an angry look on his face, and then it would, you know, follow.